There is a plantation ledger in the Louisiana State Archives that stops mid-sentence. The entry is dated August 14, 1859. The ink changes halfway through the page, from careful script to something urgent, uneven. Then, nothing. The pages that follow have been removed with a blade so precise that only the thinnest edge of paper remains in the binding. What was recorded there and who needed it gone becomes the first question in a file that refuses to close. The ledger belonged to the Belmont Estate, a cotton plantation on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, 12 miles south of Baton Rouge. For 30 years, the Belmont family kept meticulous records, crops, expenditures, the birth and death of every enslaved person under their ownership. But in August 1859, something changed. The handwriting shifts. The tone becomes clipped. And then, silence. Beside the ledger, filed under a different archive number, is a coroner's report from September of that same year. It is a woman, Patience Belmont, though Belmont was not her name by birth or law, only by proximity. She was enslaved. She was 36 years old. The cause of death is listed as fever, written in a hand that does not match the rest of the document. There are no further details, no witness statements, no attending physician named. What remains is the absence, a missing page, a single notation, and the sense that whatever Patience Belmont knew, it was enough to alter ink, erase paper, and close the archive before it could speak. Before we begin this investigation, I want to know, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. Because the story that follows is not only about the South, it is about every place where silence became policy, where records were rewritten, and where the keepers of history decided what could be remembered. Now, let us return to the ledger. Belmont Hall still stands, not as it was, but as a ruin, overgrown, fenced, marked by a historical plaque that says less than it should. The house was built in 1821 by Cornelius Belmont, a man who made his wealth in cotton, credit, and the forced labor of more than 200 souls. By the time of his death in 1857, the estate was one of the largest in the parish. His son, Theodore, inherited it all. The house sits on a bend in the river where the current slows and the water turns brown with silt. In summer, the air is thick enough to taste. In the archive photographs, sepia-toned, edges curled, the main house appears stately, columned, framed by oak trees older than the nation. But if you look closely at those images, at the edges of the frame, you can see the other structures, the quarters, the kitchens, the outbuildings where the labor that built the Belmont fortune was housed, hidden, erased from the composed center of the photograph. Patience was born in one of those buildings. There is no birth certificate, no baptismal record. What exists is a single line in a property inventory dated 1823. One girl child, Mother Celia, appraised value $200. That girl was Patience. By 1840, she appears again in the ledger, this time with a notation beside her name, house servant, literate. Literate. That word is underlined, and in the margin, written in a different hand, a question mark. It is rare to find such a note. Literacy among the enslaved was not only uncommon, it was illegal in most southern states after 1830. Teaching an enslaved person to read or write could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. Yet here is Patience, noted in her owner's own record as someone who could read. The question is not whether she learned. The question is what she read and what she understood. In the spring of 1858, a letter was sent to Theodore Belmont from a law office in New Orleans. The firm no longer exists. The building where it operated is now a hotel. But the letter survived, misfiled in a collection donated to Tulane University in 1903. It was discovered in 2011 during a digitization project. No one had read it in over a century. The letter is formal, cautious. It refers to a matter of inheritance and questions regarding provenance of title. It does not name Patience directly, but it asks Theodore Belmont to provide documentation related to the woman Patience in service at Belmont Hall, born approximately 1823. The request is specific. It asks for proof of purchase or proof of birth under ownership. The tone suggests that someone, somewhere, has raised a challenge. Theodore Belmont's reply does not exist in the archive. But 3 months later, another letter arrives from the same firm. This one is shorter, it thanks Theodore for his cooperation and notes that the matter has been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. What matter? What resolution? The file contains no further explanation, but the timing is critical. That second letter is dated July 1858. 14 months later, Patience is dead, and the plantation ledger, the one that recorded her life in careful script for 36 years, stops. There is a term in archival work, suspicious coherence. It describes the moment when documents align too neatly, when the gaps are too symmetrical, when the silence follows a pattern. This is one of those moments. The slave quarters at Belmont Hall were demolished in 1879. What remains are the foundations, brick footings half buried in mud and root systems, marked now by metal survey stakes and the occasional artifact hunt conducted by universities with grant funding and permissions signed in triplicate. In 2006, an archaeological team from LSU excavated one of the cabin sites. What they found was ordinary, and then it was not. Buttons, nails, fragments of ceramic dishware, a rusted spoon, the expected debris of lives lived in structures designed to be temporary, disposable. But beneath the hearthstone of one cabin, cabin 7, according to the excavation map, they found something else, a small wooden box sealed with tar, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away. Inside the box were papers, not many, perhaps a dozen sheets, some intact, some fragmentary. They were letters, written in a steady hand on paper that had once been fine but had degraded in the damp. The letters were unsigned, undated, but the content was unmistakable. They were abolitionist correspondence. Appeals, testimonies, names of sympathizers, routes, meeting places, evidence of a network. The box was catalogued, photographed, and placed in climate-controlled storage. The letters have never been displayed. The reason given is preservation concerns. But there's another reason, written in the internal notes of the archive: uncertain provenance, possible ethical complications regarding attribution. Translation: no one knows who hid those letters. But the location, cabin 7, appears in Belmont estate records as the dwelling assigned to Patience and her mother Celia from 1823 until Celia's death in 1851. After that, Patience lived there alone. In the summer of 1857, a man arrived at Belmont Hall. His name was Silas Good, and he came from Charleston with a letter of introduction from a business associate of Cornelius Belmont, the patriarch who had died only months before. Good was described in a brief diary entry by Theodore's wife, Marguerite, as a gentleman of serious demeanor and particular interest in father's affairs. Good stayed at Belmont Hall for 6 days. During that time, according to Marguerite's diary, he spent considerable hours in father's study, reviewing papers and records. He took his meals in the main house but was seen on at least 2 occasions, walking the grounds alone, near the quarters, in the early evening when the air was cooling and the work had stopped. On the 7th day, Good left. There is no record of what he found or what he was looking for. But 2 weeks later, Theodore Belmont traveled to New Orleans. He stayed there for 4 days. His travel is noted in the ledger. Expenses paid, accommodations listed, but not the purpose. When Theodore returned to Belmont Hall, Patience was moved from the main house to the quarters. She had worked as a house servant for nearly 2 decades. Now, without explanation, she was reassigned to field work. The notation in the ledger is brief. Reassignment, effective immediately. Discretion required. Discretion. That word appears only once in 30 years of Belmont records. It appears next to Patience's name. There is a photograph of Silas Good in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. He is seated, unsmiling, in a dark coat. His eyes are sharp. In the caption, written in pencil on the back of the photograph, someone has noted, "Agent, Estate Settlements, Discreet Inquiries." The photograph is dated 1856. There is a theory, rarely spoken aloud in academic circles, that some enslaved house servants became unintentional archivists. They were present in rooms where deals were struck, wills were written, letters were read aloud. They served coffee and stood in corners and were expected to be invisible. But invisibility is not the same as absence. And memory, unlike paper, does not require permission. Patience worked in the Belmont house from the age of 17. She cleaned the study. She maintained the library. And according to one fragmented account, An 1889 interview with a formerly enslaved man named Joseph Reed, who had worked at Belmont Hall in his youth. Patience could read better than most white folk, though she never said so aloud. The interview is housed in the Federal Writers Project collection, part of the WPA's effort in the 1930s to document the testimonies of the last living survivors of slavery. Reed was 84 when he was interviewed. His memory was sharp, and when asked about Patience, he paused. Then he said, "She knew things. Papers that came through that house? She saw them. She knew who owed what and who was owed. And that's a dangerous kind of knowing." What papers? The interviewer did not press. Reed did not elaborate, but the implication is staggering. Patience may have had access to financial records, correspondences, legal documents that detailed not only the operations of the Belmont estate, but its entanglements, debts, partnerships, vulnerabilities. In the months before Cornelius Belmont's death, the estate was in turmoil. Cotton prices had fallen. Creditors were circling. There were rumors of insolvency, of properties mortgaged beyond recovery. If Patience had seen the documents that passed through that house, she would have known something Theodore Belmont desperately needed to conceal. The empire was crumbling. And empires, when they fall, eliminate witnesses. There is a trial record from 1860, a civil suit filed in the parish court of East Baton Rouge. The case involved a disputed land claim adjacent to the Belmont estate. The transcript runs to 43 pages, but one section has been removed. The page numbers jump from 11 to 15. Pages 12, 13, and 14 are gone. In the remaining text, there's a reference to testimony provided by a witness no longer available for examination. The witness is not named, but in the margin, faint, almost illegible, someone has written a single word: Patience. If she testified, or if her testimony was recorded before her death, it would have been explosive. Enslaved people could not testify in court in most circumstances. But there were exceptions. Cases involving property disputes, fraud, or contested wills, where their statements could be taken in deposition, especially if no white witness could corroborate the facts. What did Patience know? What did she say? And why were those pages removed from a public record? The case was settled out of court in 1861. The settlement terms are sealed. The Belmont family retained the land, but the costs were significant. Within 2 years, Theodore Belmont had sold off 3 parcels of the estate and dismissed half his workforce. The empire was dissolving, and Patience, the woman who might have spoken, who might have known, who might have been the only living record of what truly transpired in the Belmont study, was already gone. Her death certificate, filed in September 1859, lists the cause as fever. There is no attending physician's signature. There is no witness. There is only a date, a name, and a silence that has lasted 166 years. Until now. The coroner's report names no doctor. This is unusual. In 1859, even on a plantation, deaths were typically attended by a physician, or at the very least, a white overseer who could sign the documentation. But Patience's death record is signed only by Theodore Belmont himself, as head of household and witness to death. There is a problem with this. 3 days before Patience's death, a physician named Dr. Amos Treadwell was called to Belmont Hall. This is recorded in Treadwell's personal account book, which survived in his family's papers until they were donated to the Louisiana Historical Society in 1974. The entry reads, August 31, 1859, Belmont Estate, consultation fee $5. No other details. But Dr. Treadwell's name does not appear on Patience's death certificate. He is not listed as attending. He is not mentioned in any document related to her death. And when a researcher in 1998 attempted to locate further records from Treadwell's practice, she found that his records for the period between August and October 1859 are missing. The journal skips 3 months. No explanation is provided. Dr. Treadwell lived until 1881. In his later years, he wrote a brief memoir, unpublished, held now in manuscript form at Tulane. In it, he reflects on his years in practice, the cases he remembers, the patients he lost. He mentions Belmont Hall once, in a single sentence. There were cases where discretion, not diagnosis, was the duty required of me. He does not elaborate. There is a photograph of Treadwell, taken in the 1870s. He is seated, elderly, his face lined, In his lap, he holds a leather medical bag. And if you look closely, just visible on his desk in the background, you can see a stack of journals, ledgers, carefully bound. But the journals that survive in the archive do not include the months when patients died. The question is simple. What did Dr. Treadwell see at Belmont Hall in August 1859? And why was he paid to forget? There is a cemetery at Belmont Hall. It sits on a rise above the quarters, shaded by magnolia trees. The Belmont family is buried there. Cornelius, Margaret, Theodore, and their children. The stones are marble, carved with angels, inscribed with scripture. They are maintained by a preservation society that holds an annual memorial event each October. 50 yards to the east, separated by a fence line that no longer exists, is another burial ground. There are no markers, no stones, no names. It is where the enslaved were buried, those who died at Belmont Hall over the course of 5 decades. The ground is uneven, overgrown, marked only by depressions in the earth and the occasional iron stake placed by archaeologists in the 1980s. In 2003, a ground-penetrating radar survey was conducted as part of a graduate thesis project. The survey identified approximately 70 burial sites. Most were aligned east-west, consistent with Christian burial practices. But one site, near the southern edge of the plot, was different. It was isolated. The burial was shallow, and the radar suggested the presence of an object, something dense, metallic, placed in the grave. The site was never excavated. University policy prohibits the disturbance of burial grounds without explicit descendant permission, and no descendants of the Belmont enslaved population could be conclusively identified. The grave remains undisturbed. But there is a map in the archive, a hand-drawn sketch found in Theodore Belmont's papers, undated. It shows the quarters, the main house, and a small plot of land marked with an X. Beside the X, in faint pencil, P. Sept. 1859. If that mark indicates Patience's grave, then she is buried alone, away from the others, in a plot that someone wanted kept separate. And if there is an object in that grave, a box, a container, something sealed and meant to stay hidden, then we are left with a question that cannot be answered without disturbing the dead. What did Patience take with her? There is a letter in the Belmont family papers written in October 1859, 1 month after Patience's death. It is from a lawyer in New Orleans named Charles Fontaine. The letter is addressed to Theodore Belmont and marked confidential. The letter is careful. It does not mention Patience by name, but it speaks of the recent resolution of a delicate matter, and warns Theodore to ensure that no further documentation surfaces that might complicate the estate's legal standing. It advises him to review all records with care, and to dispose of any materials that could be misinterpreted by parties with interest in challenging the family's holdings. The letter ends with a single line. Silence, in this case, is the only protection. Charles Fontaine was a prominent attorney in New Orleans, known for handling estate disputes, debt settlements, and cases involving contested inheritances. His client list included some of the wealthiest plantation families in Louisiana. He was discreet, expensive, and effective. And in 1859 he was advising Theodore Belmont to destroy evidence. What evidence? The letter does not say. But the timing is precise. It arrives 1 month after Patience's death, 3 months after the missing pages in the trial transcript, and 5 months after Silas Good's visit to Belmont Hall. Fontaine's correspondence with the Belmont family ends in 1860. There are no further letters, no invoices, no records of services rendered. It is as if, once the delicate matter was resolved, the relationship simply ceased to exist. Charles Fontaine died in 1867. His personal papers were destroyed in a fire at his office in 1868. The fire was ruled accidental. No investigation was conducted, and any record of what Fontaine knew about Patience, about the disputed inheritance, about the documents that needed to be disposed of, was lost. Or so the archive would have you believe. The letters found beneath Cabin 7 were not random. They were part of a network. The names mentioned in those letters, encoded, fragmented, written in careful shorthand, have been cross-referenced with known abolitionist activity in the South during the 1850s. Some of the names match. Others do not appear in any other document. They are ghosts in the archive, people who moved in secret, who left no trail, who communicated through trusted intermediaries. One name appears 3 times in the letters, R.M. The initials are never explained. But in 1858, a man named Robert Maddox was arrested in Natchez, Mississippi, on charges of inciting insurrection and distribution of seditious materials. He was held for 6 weeks, then released without trial. The charges were dropped. No explanation was given. Robert Maddox was a free black man, a co-opper by trade, who traveled frequently between Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. He had contacts in New Orleans. He knew the river. And according to a brief mention in a Natchez newspaper from 1858, he was known to associate with persons of questionable moral standing. Translation: abolitionists. If Patience had access to abolitionist correspondence, if she was part of a network that moved information, that hid documents, that passed messages through the very houses where enslavers conducted their business, then she was not simply a witness. She was a participant. She was a threat. The letters were hidden under her cabin. They were wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in tar, buried beneath the hearthstone. A place where heat would keep the ground dry, where no one would dig, where they could remain until someone came looking. But no one came. Patience died. The letters stayed hidden for nearly 150 years. And when they were finally found, they were locked away again. In November 1859, 2 months after Patience's death, a fire broke out in the Belmont Hall study. It was contained quickly, according to Theodore Belmont's insurance claim, and caused minimal damage. The claim lists the losses: 1 desk, several ledgers, and miscellaneous papers of no significant value. But there is a problem with this account. Fire does not select, it spreads. Yet the fire at Belmont Hall burned only the study, only the room where Cornelius Belmont had kept his records, where Theodore conducted business, where documents related to the estate's finances and legal disputes were stored. The rest of the house was untouched. The insurance company paid the claim without question. But in the company's internal files, held now in the archives of the defunct Southern Mutual Insurance Company, there is a notation: claim approved. Origin of fire, undetermined. No further investigation warranted. Translation: suspicious, but not worth pursuing. If the fire was set deliberately, if it was meant to destroy specific documents, records that might have been seen by Patience, records that might have been referenced in the letters hidden under cabin 7, records that a lawyer in New Orleans had advised Theodore to dispose of, then it was effective. Whatever burned in that study is gone. The insurance claim does not list specifics. The ledgers that survived are fragmentary, incomplete, and the timing, 2 months after Patience's death, 1 month after the lawyer's warning, is not coincidence, it is method. Marguerite Belmont, Theodore's wife, kept a diary. It was not a daily account, but a sporadic record of events, observations, and grievances. The diary was never published. It was found in an attic trunk in 1952, after the last of the Belmont descendants sold the property. The diary is now held in the Louisiana State University Special Collections, fragile, yellowed, written in a cramped hand that suggests both haste and secrecy. In the diary, Patience is mentioned twice. The first mention is from 1856. Patience has become indispensable to the household. She manages the linens, oversees the kitchen, and is more reliable than any servant we have employed. Theodore says she is too familiar, but I find her competent. The second mention is from August 1859. Patience is unwell. Theodore has ordered her to the quarters. I do not understand his reasoning. She has always been loyal. There are no further entries about Patience. But 2 weeks later, Marguerite writes, "There are matters in this house that I am not permitted to know. I am told it is for my protection. But I do not feel protected. I feel uneasy." That is the last mention of anything unusual in the diary. Marguerite's subsequent entries are mundane: weather, social calls, the health of her children. It is as if, after August 1859, she stopped noticing, or stopped recording, or was told to stop. The diary ends abruptly in 1862. The final entry reads, "The world we knew is gone." There is no elaboration, no explanation, just that single sentence, and then silence. Marguerite Belmont died in 1874. She is buried beside her husband in the family plot. Her diary was not mentioned in her will. It was not preserved intentionally. It survived by accident, hidden in a trunk, forgotten for nearly a century. And in its pages, Patience appears for only a moment, loyal, competent, and then suddenly unwell, removed, erased. Among the documents found in Theodore Belmont's estate papers is a map. It is hand-drawn, undated, rendered in ink on paper that is browned with age. The map shows the Mississippi River, a section of the eastern bank, and several marked locations: towns, landings, estates. One location is marked with a red circle. Beside the circle, written in small letters, R.M. Septum. The map was filed with Theodore's personal correspondence, but there is no letter or document that explains its purpose. It was simply there, folded between pages of unrelated material, as if someone had placed it for safekeeping and then forgotten it. The location marked on the map is a river landing 12 miles north of Belmont Hall. In 1859, that landing was used primarily for freight, cotton bales, timber, occasional passengers traveling upriver to Baton Rouge or downriver to New Orleans. It was not a major port. It was not heavily monitored. It was, in other words, the kind of place where someone might come and go without attracting notice. R.M. could be Robert Maddox. Septum could be September 1859, the month Patience died. If this map indicates a meeting, a rendezvous, a planned escape or exchange, then Patience was not simply a passive victim of circumstance. She may have been waiting. She may have been ready to leave. She may have had help. But the map is evidence of intent, not outcome. Whatever was planned at that river landing did not happen, or it happened differently than intended. Because Patience never left Belmont Hall. She died there, in September, and was buried in an unmarked grave. The question is, did she die before she could leave? Or was she stopped? In the 1998 research files of historian Dr. Evelyn Cormier, who spent a decade studying the Belmont estate, there is a reference to a deposition taken in 1860. The deposition was given by a man named Samuel Pruitt, a white overseer who had worked at Belmont Hall from 1855 to 1859. Pruitt was questioned in connection with the land dispute case, the same case from which pages 12, 13, and 14 of the trial transcript are missing. According to Cormier's notes, Pruitt initially testified that he had witnessed irregularities in the management of estate records, and that certain documents were altered or removed at the direction of Mr. Theodore Belmont. Pruitt also stated that the woman Patience had access to the study and may have observed these actions. But 1 week later, Pruitt submitted a second statement. In this statement, he recanted his previous testimony, claiming he had been mistaken and confused. He stated that he had no knowledge of any wrongdoing and that all records were maintained with appropriate care. Pruitt's recantation was accepted by the court. The case proceeded, the pages were removed, and Pruitt left Louisiana shortly thereafter. He moved to Texas, where he died in 1863. There is no record of what changed his mind, no letter, no payment, no threat documented in writing. But the timing is clear. Pruitt testified. He implicated Theodore, he mentioned Patience, and then suddenly he changed his story. Dr. Cormier attempted to locate Pruitt's original deposition in the parish archives. It no longer exists. The second statement, the recantation, is the only testimony that survives. In the archaeological excavation of Cabin 7, among the buttons and nails and fragments of ceramic, there was one object that stood out. A length of silk ribbon, pale blue, faded but intact, folded carefully and placed inside a small tin box. Silk was expensive. It was not a material commonly found in the quarters. Its presence suggests a gift, a keepsake, something precious enough to be hidden. The ribbon was analyzed by textile historians at LSU. The weave and dye are consistent with French imports from the 1850s, fine quality, the kind sold in New Orleans shops that catered to the wealthy. The ribbon had been handled often. The edges were frayed in a way that suggested it had been worn, or held, or touched repeatedly. There's no way to know who gave Patience the ribbon, or why she kept it, or what it meant to her. But its presence in the box, alongside the abolitionist letters, suggests that it was more than decoration. It was a marker, a connection, a reminder of something, or someone. In Marguerite Belmont's diary, there is a brief entry from 1857. I gave Patience a ribbon from New Orleans. She seemed pleased, though she said nothing. I wonder sometimes what she thinks, but she keeps her thoughts well hidden. That is the only mention. But if the ribbon found in cabin 7 is the same ribbon Marguerite gave Patience, then it was kept for 2 years, hidden away, preserved. It was important enough to bury. Or perhaps it was meant to be found. In the months before Cornelius Belmont's death, the estate was under financial pressure. Cotton prices had collapsed. Loans were coming due, and one creditor in particular was pressing for repayment, a man named Julien Marchand, a financier based in New Orleans, who had extended significant credit to the Belmont family in the early 1850s. Marchand's correspondence with Cornelius is extensive, polite at first, then increasingly insistent. By 1857, Marchand was threatening legal action. He demanded an audit of the estate's assets. He wanted an accounting of properties, enslaved persons, and outstanding debts. He was, in other words, asking for the kind of detailed financial disclosure that might reveal just how precarious the Belmont fortune really was. Cornelius Belmont died in March 1857. By June, Julien Marchand had disappeared. There is no death record, no notice in the New Orleans papers, no probate filing. Marchand simply vanishes from the historical record. His business was dissolved, his assets were sold at auction in 1858, with no explanation given for his absence. The proceeds went to settling his own debts. No family came forward. No heir claimed the estate. And his correspondence with the Belmont family, letters that should have been part of the legal record, evidence of the debt, proof of the claim, are missing from the archive. They are referenced in later documents, but the letters themselves are gone. If Marchand's disappearance was convenient for Theodore Belmont, it was also suspicious. And if Patience had seen the correspondence, if she knew the extent of the debt and the pressure Marchand was applying, then she would have been one of the few living witnesses to the estate's insolvency. Witnesses, in such circumstances, are liabilities. In the 1920s, when Belmont Hall was briefly opened to the public as a historical site, visitors were given tours of the main house, the parlor, the dining room, the grand staircase. But one room on the second floor was always locked. The tour guides referred to it as the private study and explained that it contained family documents not suitable for public viewing. The room remained locked until 1965. When the property was sold to a private buyer who had no interest in preserving its historical character. The new owner opened the room. Inside, he found shelves of ledgers, boxes of correspondence, and a small iron safe, rusted shut. The safe was eventually opened by a locksmith. Inside were 3 items: a bundle of letters tied with string, a small leather notebook, and a daguerreotype photograph. The letters were personal correspondence between Theodore and Marguerite Belmont, mundane, domestic. The notebook appeared to be a financial record, listing debts and payments, though many entries were illegible due to water damage. And the photograph showed a young black woman, seated, unsmiling, dressed in plain clothing. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, P. 1856. The photograph was catalogued and placed in storage. The notebook was sent to LSU for conservation. The letters were returned to the Belmont family descendants, who requested they remain private. But the photograph, Patience, at 33 years old, her face calm, her gaze direct, has never been publicly displayed. It sits in the archive, in a climate-controlled drawer, seen only by researchers who specifically request it. And when you look at that image, at her expression, you see something that defies the narrative of the passive, invisible servant. You see a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Cornelius Belmont's will was probated in April 1857. It is a standard document of the period. Property divided among heirs, enslaved persons distributed like furniture, assets carefully listed and assigned. Theodore inherited the plantation, the house, and the majority of the enslaved workforce. His younger brother, Marcus, received a cash settlement and 2 parcels of land in Mississippi. But there was an earlier version of the will. It was discovered in 2003, misfiled in a box of unrelated estate documents at the Louisiana State Archives. The earlier will is dated 1855. It contains many of the same provisions as the final version, but with one critical difference. It includes a clause providing for the manumission of the woman Patience upon my death in recognition of faithful service. Manumission, legal emancipation, freedom. But that clause does not appear in the final will, the one probated in 1857. It has been removed, and there is no codicil, no amendment, no legal document explaining the change. The will was simply rewritten, and the provision for Patience's freedom was erased. Why? The most likely explanation is financial. If Patience was freed, she would no longer be counted as property. Her appraised value, listed in the final will at $1,200, would be lost. And in 1857, when creditors were circling and the estate was teetering on insolvency, $1,200 was not a trivial sum. But there is another possibility. If Patience knew she was promised freedom, if she had seen the earlier will or been told of its contents, then she would have had expectations. She would have had hope. And when Cornelius died and that promise was broken, she would have had reason to speak. Freedom withheld is a powerful motive for silence or for action. There are no first-hand accounts of the night Patience died, but there are fragments, details preserved in disconnected sources that when assembled, create a pattern. From Marguerite's diary, August 30th, Theodore left the house after supper and did not return until well past midnight. He would not say where he had been. From the plantation ledger, no entry for August 30th. The next entry is September 2nd, 3 days later. From Dr. Treadwell's account book, August 31st, Belmont Estate, consultation, fee. From Joseph Reed's 1889 interview, they say she took sick sudden-like. One day she was well, next day she was gone. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody said much about it after. Patience died on the night of August 30th or in the early hours of August 31st, 1859. Her death was recorded as fever, a catch-all term used frequently in the 19th century to explain deaths that were either mysterious or inconvenient to investigate. But fevers are not instantaneous. They build, they show symptoms, they are noticed. Yet Patience, according to every account, was healthy until she was not. And then she was dead, and Theodore Belmont was signing the death certificate, and Dr. Treadwell was being paid for a consultation that he would never speak of again. What happened that night? The archive is silent. But silence, in this case, is not absence. It is deliberate. It is structured. It is the sound of something being covered up. In a private collection in Virginia, held by a descendant of one of the families who did business with the Belmonts, there is a letter dated September 1859. It is addressed to no one. It is signed by no one. It is written in a careful hand on paper that matches the stationery used at Belmont Hall. The letter begins, "It is done." It continues, "The matter has been resolved as necessary. There will be no further complications. The woman is no longer a concern. All records have been secured. You may rest assured that our interests are protected." That is all. No names, no details, no explanation. Just a confirmation that something has been completed, that a problem has been eliminated, that silence has been ensured. The letter was found among the papers of a New Orleans businessman named Victor Chastain, who had financial dealings with Theodore Belmont in the late 1850s. Chastain's role in the Belmont estate is unclear. He is mentioned in passing in several documents, always in connection with loans or property transactions, but never as a primary figure. He is background, he is support, he is the kind of man who facilitates without appearing in the official record. If the letter was sent from Theodore to Chastain, or from someone acting on Theodore's behalf, then it is evidence not just of Patience's death, but of intent. "The woman is no longer a concern" is not the language of illness. It is not the language of accident. It is the language of action taken, of a problem solved, of a witness silenced. The letter was never catalogued in a public archive. It remains in private hands. The family who owns it has declined to allow it to be published or widely studied. They do not deny its existence. They simply prefer it remain private. And so it does. In 2019, during a routine land survey conducted ahead of a proposed development near the former Belmont estate, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies consistent with human remains. The site was not the known burial ground near the quarters. It was half a mile away, in a wooded area that had never been cleared, never farmed, never marked. The survey identified at least 12 burial sites. They were shallow, irregular, without the alignment or spacing of a formal cemetery. The state archaeologist was called in, the project was halted, and the site was quietly designated as a protected area, closed to excavation without further legal review. There is no record of this second burial ground in any Belmont estate document. It does not appear on maps. It is not mentioned in ledgers or correspondence. Its existence was unknown until the radar survey revealed it. Who was buried there? Enslaved people who died under circumstances that required concealment. People whose deaths could not be explained or whose burials could not be conducted in the open. People who were erased not just in life, but in death. If Patience's grave is in that second site, if she was moved after the initial burial, or if she was never buried in the marked cemetery at all, then every assumption about her death becomes more fragile. Because burials in hidden locations are not accidents. They are choices. They are acts of concealment. And concealment requires a reason. Patience is the only enslaved person at Belmont Hall whose records end abruptly. There are others. In 1854, a man named Isaac, listed as a blacksmith, disappears from the ledger. No death record, no sale record, just gone. In 1856, a woman named Rose, a seamstress, is noted as removed. The destination is not specified. In 1858, a child named Samuel, age 8, is listed in one inventory, absent from the next. No explanation. These are not anomalies. They are a pattern. And patterns in archival work are evidence of system. Someone at Belmont Hall was managing information. Someone was deciding what to record and what to erase. Someone understood that a person could be removed from history by simply omitting them from the ledger. But Patience is different. She is mentioned, she is noted. She appears in letters, diaries, inventories, photographs. She is documented enough that her absence becomes conspicuous. She is visible enough that her disappearance leaves a shadow. That shadow is what brought us here. If Patience had lived, if she had been called to testify in the land dispute case, if she had been allowed to speak under oath, what would she have said? We can only infer, but the documents suggest a narrative. She would have confirmed that Cornelius Belmont altered financial records to conceal debts. She would have testified that Theodore Belmont removed pages from ledgers and correspondence after his father's death. She would have identified Julian Marchand's claims as legitimate, supported by documents she had seen in the study. She would have described meetings, visitors who came at night, letters that arrived sealed, conversations conducted behind closed doors. She would have, in other words, dismantled the fiction of Belmont respectability. She would have revealed that the empire was built not on prosperity, but on debt, deception, and the exploitation of black labor. And she would have done so with the authority of someone who had been there, who had seen it, who could name names and dates and amounts. That testimony would have destroyed Theodore Belmont. It would have exposed the estate to legal action, to creditor claims, to public scandal. It would have been the end of the family's standing. So Patience did not testify. She did not live long enough. And the pages of the trial record that might have contained her words were removed. But the silence itself is testimony. Dr. Evelyn Cormier, the historian whose research files have been invaluable to this investigation, stopped working on the Belmont Project in 1999. She published a brief article summarizing her findings, focused on plantation economics, labor systems, and the collapse of the antebellum elite, but she never completed the book she had planned. The manuscript, incomplete, sits in her personal papers at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. In a 2011 interview for an oral history project, Cormier was asked why she abandoned the research. She paused. Then she said, "I found things that no one wanted found. Documents that implicated not just the Belmonts, but other families, institutions, people whose descendants are still prominent. I was advised that pursuing the project further would be unwise." She did not elaborate. She would not name who advised her. But she did say this: "There is a woman in those records, Patience, whose story deserves to be told. But telling it would require implicating people who have power now, today, in 2011. And I was not willing to pay that price." Dr. Cormier died in 2018. Her research files were donated to the university archive where they remain accessible to scholars. But the manuscript, the unfinished book that would have centered Patience's story, was never completed. This is how history is controlled. Not by destroying records, but by making it too costly to pursue them. In 2015, a graduate student at LSU named Marcus Poole was researching antebellum tax records for a dissertation on plantation economics. He was not looking for patients. He was not investigating the Belmonts. He was simply compiling data, cross-referencing property values, calculating tax burdens, and then he found something. In the 1858 tax assessment for the Belmont estate, there is a line item that does not appear in previous years. Compensation paid to manumitted person, $800. Manumitted person. Freed. The tax code of the time required plantation owners to report any payments made to formerly enslaved people who remained on the property as hired laborers. It was rare, but not unheard of. The payment was taxable income for the estate, but there is no record in the Belmont ledgers of anyone being manumitted in 1858. No deed of emancipation, no name, no documentation, except one possibility: patience. If Cornelius Belmont, before his death, had privately freed patients, not through his will, but through a separate legal instrument, and if Theodore had been paying her as a hired servant in 1858, then that would explain the tax entry. It would also explain why the earlier will contained a manumission clause, because it had already been done. But if Patience was legally free in 1858, then her death in 1859 was not the death of an enslaved person. It was the death of a free black woman, and the laws governing that death, the investigation that should have been conducted, the protections she should have had, were entirely different. If she was free and her death was not investigated, then it was not just a cover-up, it was murder. The leather notebook found in Theodore Belmont's locked safe, the one sent to LSU for conservation, was finally transcribed in 2020. The process was painstaking. The ink had faded. Water damage had blurred entire sections, but enough remained to reconstruct the contents. The notebook is a ledger of payments, not official payments, not the kind recorded in the estate's financial records. These are private transactions, cash paid, dates noted, no names, just initials. One entry from July 1859 reads, SG $500, inquiry closed. SG could be Silas Good, the man from Charleston who visited Belmont Hall in 1857. Another entry from August 1859 reads, CF $300, documentation secured. CF could be Charles Fontaine, the lawyer who advised Theodore to destroy evidence. And a final entry from September 1859 reads, AT $200, consultation, final. AT could be Amos Treadwell, the doctor who attended Belmont Hall the day before Patience died. These are not ordinary fees. They are payments for silence, for discretion, for services rendered off the books, in cash, without receipts or public record. And the dates align perfectly with the key moments in Patience's final months: the investigation into her legal status, the warning from the lawyer, the night she died. The notebook is evidence of a conspiracy, not a conspiracy in the grand sense, but in the literal sense. People working together in secret to conceal a crime. The notebook has never been published. It remains in the conservation lab, accessible only to researchers with specific permissions. The university has cited privacy concerns and ethical considerations as reasons for restricting access. But the truth is simpler. The notebook names names. And some of those names are still recognizable in Louisiana. Joseph Reed, the formerly enslaved man who was interviewed in 1889, had more to say about Patience than what appears in the published WPA transcript. The full interview, unedited, unredacted, was found in 2008 in the Library of Congress, part of a batch of materials that had been misfiled and forgotten. In the full transcript, Reed speaks more candidly. He describes Patience as sharp, sharper than any white man I knew. She could read a contract, tell you what it meant, what it didn't say. People at the hall knew it. And that's why they feared her. He continues, they say she died of fever, but I was there. I saw her the day before. She wasn't sick, she was scared. She told me, Joseph, if something happens to me, you remember this. I ain't done nothing wrong. What I know because I saw it, and they can't unsee what I seen. The interviewer pressed him. What did she see? Reed paused, then he said, papers, debts, names, things that proved the Belmonts were broke, things that proved they stole from folks, lied to folks, sold folks they didn't own. Patience saw it all, and she remembered. That was her crime. She remembered. Reed died in 1890, 1 year after the interview. He was 85 years old. His testimony was never widely circulated. It was filed, catalogued, and forgotten. Until now. In 2012, someone placed a grave marker in the unmarked burial ground at Belmont Hall. It was not authorized. No one claimed responsibility. The marker simply appeared one day, a simple stone, flat against the ground, inscribed with one word: patience. The Preservation Society that maintains the estate was furious. They demanded the marker be removed. They argued that there was no proof the grave was Patience's, that the placement was speculative, that it violated the protocols for historical sites. But before they could remove it, local activists rallied. They argued that the lack of markers in the enslaved burial ground was itself an erasure, that naming even one grave was an act of restoration, that Patience's story mattered enough to be marked, whether or not the exact location of her remains could be confirmed. The marker stayed. Today, visitors to Belmont Hall leave flowers at that stone. They leave notes, they leave stones in the Jewish tradition of honoring the dead. The marker has become a site of pilgrimage, a focal point for those who understand that Patience's death was not an accident, not a fever, not a footnote. The marker is small, the inscription is simple, but it says, someone was here, someone mattered, someone is remembered. And that is more than Theodore Belmont ever wanted. In 1858, Louisiana law allowed for the manumission of enslaved people under specific conditions. One of those conditions was that the enslaved person must leave the state with 30 days of emancipation unless they could prove good character and obtain permission from the parish court to remain. If Patience was freed in 1858, she would have been required to either leave Louisiana or petition the court for permission to stay. There is no record of such a petition. But there is also no record of her leaving, which means either A, she was never legally freed and the tax record is an error, or B, she was freed but remained in Louisiana illegally, which would have made her vulnerable to re-enslavement under state law. If she was vulnerable, she would have needed protection. She would have needed someone with power to shield her from scrutiny. And the only person with that power at Belmont Hall was Theodore. This creates a different kind of leverage. If Theodore was protecting Patience from legal consequences, he was also controlling her. She was free, but not free. She was dependent on his silence, his discretion, his willingness to overlook her illegal residency. And if she threatened to speak, if she became more of a liability than an asset, then that protection could be withdrawn. She could be reported, re-enslaved, sold, disappeared. Or she could simply be eliminated. The law, in this case, was not protection. It was a weapon. The daguerreotype found in Theodore's safe, the image of Patience from 1856, raises a question. Why did Theodore keep it? Photographs of enslaved people were not common. They were expensive, time-consuming to produce, and typically reserved for documenting valuable property or creating sentimental keepsakes. But this photograph is different. Patience is not posed as property. She is seated, centered, her expression direct. She is not smiling, but she is not blank. She looks, for lack of a better word, aware. On the back of the photograph, in addition to her name and the date, there is another inscription, faint but legible. Security. Security. Not keepsake. Not documentation. Security. If the photograph was taken as leverage, evidence of Patience's identity, her presence, her connection to the Belmont family, then it was not sentimentality that preserved it. It was control. Theodore kept the photograph because it was proof. Proof that she existed. Proof that she was known. Proof that if she disappeared, someone might ask questions. But photographs can also be used as evidence of death. They can be presented to creditors, to lawyers, to courts, as confirmation that a person lived, and therefore that their claims, their knowledge, their testimony is now beyond reach. The photograph was locked in a safe for over a century. It was kept hidden. It was never displayed, it was never shared, it was evidence waiting to be used, and then it was evidence buried to prevent its use. Either way, it was never about Patience. It was about what Patience knew. In 2018, a genealogical research firm was hired by a family in Georgia to trace their ancestry. The research led them back to Louisiana, to Belmont Hall, to the records of the enslaved population. And there, in a fragmented list of names, they found a connection. A woman named Celia, mother of Patience. Celia had 2 children. Patience, and a daughter named Ruth, born in 1838. Ruth was sold in 1852, at age 14, to a family in Mississippi. The sale is documented in the Belmont Ledger. The buyer is listed as J. Halloran, Natchez. Ruth's trail goes cold after that. But genealogical records in Mississippi suggest that a woman named Ruth, owned by the Halloran family, had children, and those children had children. And one of those descendants is alive today, living in Georgia, unaware until 2018 that their lineage traces back to Patience's younger sister. When the genealogist contacted the family with this information, they declined to pursue it further. They did not want to know more. They did not want to engage with the history. One family member explained in an email that was later shared with researchers, "This is not a past we want to claim. It is too painful. It is too complicated. Let the dead rest." That decision is understandable, but it also means that Patience's story remains incomplete. There are living descendants who could, if they chose, add their voices, their memories, their family stories to the record. But they have chosen silence, and silence, once again, is what the archive demands. Patience's literacy, noted in the Belmont Ledger, confirmed by Joseph Reed, implied by the letters hidden in her cabin, was illegal. Teaching an enslaved person to read or write was a crime in Louisiana after 1830. The law was clear. Literacy was dangerous. It enabled escape. It enabled communication. It enabled resistance. So who taught Patience? There are no records, no letters, no testimony, but there are hints. In Marguerite's diary, there's a brief entry from 1840. Patience is reading to the children. She has a gentle voice. I wonder where she learned. In the estate records, there is a notation from 1838. Tutor engaged for household instruction. Mr. Elias Crane. Compensation, $150 a year. Elias Crane was a school teacher from Massachusetts, hired by Cornelius Belmont to educate his children. He lived at Belmont Hall from 1838 to 1841. There is no record of what happened to him after he left. No further employment, no forwarding address. He simply disappears from the historical record. But if Crane taught Patience, if he, as a Northerner with abolitionist sympathies, defied Louisiana law and taught an enslaved child to read, then he would have had reason to leave quietly, without documentation, without drawing attention to his actions. And Patience would have had reason to remember him. In the Belmont Plantation Ledger, the entry recording Patience's death is written in a different ink than the entries immediately before and after it. This was noted by a forensic document analyst in 2016 during a routine conservation assessment. The ink used for most of the 1859 entries is iron gall ink, standard for the period, made from tannic acid and iron salts, brownish-black in color. But the ink used for the September 3rd entry, which records Patience's death, is a different formulation. It is darker, more blue-black, consistent with a different batch or a different supplier. This suggests that the entry was not written on September 3rd. It was written later, using ink that was not available or not in use at the time of Patience's death, and then inserted into the ledger to maintain the appearance of continuity. Backdating records is a form of falsification. It is evidence of intent to deceive, and if the death record was falsified, then every other detail, the date, the cause, the circumstances, becomes suspect. The analyst's report was filed with the archive. It has never been publicly referenced. The ledger remains on display under glass with no notation explaining the ink discrepancy. But the evidence is there. Patience's death was recorded after the fact. Someone waited, someone planned, someone wanted the record to appear routine, and then they wrote it in the wrong ink. In 1860, 1 year after Patience's death, Belmont Hall experienced another fire. This one was not contained. It burned through the west wing of the house, destroying 2 bedrooms, a storage room, and part of the hallway. The damage was extensive. The insurance claim totaled $3,000, a significant sum. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by an overturned lamp. But there is no evidence of a lamp in the room where the fire started. And the timing, 1 year after Patience's death, 6 months after the second fire in the study, is conspicuous. Fires are useful. They destroy evidence, they erase documents, objects, traces of presence, and they can be blamed on accident, on carelessness, on the inevitable hazards of 19th century life. But 2 fires in 2 years, both in locations where records were kept, both resulting in minimal investigation, both ruled accidental. That is not bad luck. That is method. What burned in the West Wing? The insurance claim does not specify. The estate records do not elaborate. But one detail stands out. The storage room that burned was directly above the study. If documents had been moved there for safekeeping, if records that could not be destroyed in the first fire had been relocated, then the second fire completed the job. By 1860, whatever Patience had seen, whatever she had known, whatever documents could have corroborated her testimony, it was ash. The Civil War began in 1861. By 1865, the Confederacy had collapsed. Slavery was abolished. The legal structures that had sustained plantations like Belmont Hall were dismantled. And in the chaos of Reconstruction, many debts, many crimes, many lies were forgotten. Theodore Belmont survived the war. He died in 1873 at age 57 of natural causes. He is buried in the family plot, beside his father, his wife, his children. His gravestone lists him as a devoted son, a faithful steward of his family's legacy. There was no investigation into Patience's death, no inquiry, no legal consequence. The war erased the possibility of accountability, and Theodore, like so many men of his class and time, died with his reputation intact. But history is not over. The records remain, the documents survive, the questions persist. And Patience, though silenced, is not gone. In 2020, during the summer of national reckoning with racial violence and historical injustice, a group of activists in Baton Rouge held a memorial for Patience. They gathered at the site of the old Belmont estate, now overgrown and fenced, and they read her name aloud. They read the names of everyone buried in the unmarked cemetery. They placed flowers. They sang. They demanded that the estate be preserved, not as a monument to the Belmont family, but as a site of memory for the enslaved people who built it. The memorial was not authorized. The Preservation Society complained, but the activists returned the next week, and the week after that. And eventually the society agreed to install a plaque acknowledging the enslaved population of Belmont Hall. The plaque is small. It lists no names. It offers no details, but it says, "In memory of the enslaved men, women, and children who labored on this land. Their stories matter." It is not enough, but it is something. After Dr. Evelyn Cormier abandoned her research, another scholar took it up. Her name is Dr. Nia Thompson, a historian at Xavier University in New Orleans, and she has spent the last decade piecing together Patience's story from the fragments Cormier left behind. Dr. Thompson's work is meticulous. She has traced every document, every reference, every oblique mention of Patience in the archive. She has interviewed descendants of the Belmont family, those who would speak to her. She has filed Freedom of Information requests for sealed records. She has pushed back against institutional resistance and family objections. And she has written a book. It is called The Woman Who Knew: Patience and the Collapse of Belmont Hall. It was published in 2022. The book is not speculative. It is not sensational. It is a careful, evidence-based reconstruction of Patience's life and death and the systems of power that conspired to silence her. It names names, it cites documents, it presents the case that Patience was murdered, that the murder was covered up, and that the cover-up involved multiple people: a lawyer, a doctor, a businessman, and Theodore Belmont himself. The book has been controversial. Some reviewers have praised it as a necessary reckoning with the violence of slavery and the corruption of the planter class. Others have dismissed it as speculation based on incomplete evidence. The Belmont family descendants have refused to comment. But the book exists, and it cannot be unwritten. In 2021, Dr. Thompson petitioned the Louisiana state archaeologist to allow DNA testing of remains in the unmarked burial ground at Belmont Hall. The goal was to identify which, if any, of the burials might be Patience, and to potentially connect her to living descendants through mitochondrial DNA analysis. The petition was denied. The official reason was insufficient justification for disturbing human remains without confirmed descendant consent. But the subtext was clear. The state was unwilling to open the investigation. Too many questions, too many implications, too much risk. Dr. Thompson appealed. The appeal was denied. She filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit was dismissed. Patience remains in the ground wherever she is, unidentified, untested. Her physical remains as inaccessible as her testimony. But her story is not in the bones. It is in the documents. It is in the contradictions. It is in the silences that speak louder than any inscription on a gravestone. Patience's death is not unique. It is one story among thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of stories that were silenced, erased, covered up. The enslaved who knew too much, who saw too much, who remembered too much. They were threats. And threats were eliminated. What makes Patience's story distinct is not the fact of her murder, but the degree to which it was documented, hidden, and then, eventually, uncovered. The archive preserved just enough to reveal the pattern of concealment, and that pattern is the evidence. We will never know exactly what happened on the night of August 30th, 1859. We will never hear Patience's voice, her testimony, her account of what she saw and what she knew. But we know enough. We know she was literate. We know she had access to documents. We know she was connected to an abolitionist network. We know she was legally freed or on the verge of freedom. We know she became a liability. We know she died suddenly, under suspicious circumstances. We know her death was not investigated. We know the records were altered. We know people were paid for silence. And we know that silence is not accidental. It is deliberate. It is policy. It is power. In 2023, the daguerreotype of Patience was finally displayed publicly for the first time. It was included in an exhibition at the Louisiana State Museum called Hidden Voices: Enslaved Lives in the Antebellum South. The photograph was placed in a central case, enlarged, with a detailed placard explaining her story. Visitors to the exhibition stopped at that photograph. They looked at her face, they read the placard, and many of them wept. One visitor, an elderly black woman from Baton Rouge, stood in front of the photograph for nearly 20 minutes. A museum docent approached her, asked if she was all right. The woman said, "That could be my great-great-grandmother. That could be me." The exhibition ran for 6 months. Over 50,000 people saw it. And when it closed, the photograph was returned to the archive, placed back in its climate-controlled drawer. But something had shifted. Patience was no longer a footnote. She was no longer a nameless victim. She was a person, with a face, with a story, with a legacy. And that legacy is this: she mattered. She resisted. She knew. And because she knew, she was dangerous. In 2024, Dr. Thompson's book was added to the curriculum at several Louisiana high schools as part of a unit on slavery and resistance. Students read excerpts, they analyzed primary sources, they debated the evidence, they wrote essays on the question, was Patience murdered? The lesson was controversial. Parents objected, school boards debated, but the teachers who taught it reported something remarkable. Students were engaged, they asked questions, they wanted to know more. They wanted to understand how power works, how history is controlled, how silence is enforced. One student, a 16-year-old girl in Baton Rouge, wrote in her essay, "Patience didn't have a voice then, but we can give her a voice now. We can tell her story. We can make sure she's not forgotten." That essay was read aloud at a school board meeting. It went viral on social media, and it became, in a small but significant way, part of the larger conversation about whose stories get told, whose deaths get investigated, whose lives matter. The Belmont Plantation Ledger ends in 1865. The final entry, dated April 20th, records the emancipation of all enslaved people at Belmont Hall, as mandated by federal law. The entry is perfunctory. All persons formerly held in bondage are hereby declared free. No further entries required. But there is one more line, written in a different hand, added later in the margin. God will judge. The handwriting does not match Theodore's. It does not match Marguerite's. It is uncertain, shaky, as if written by someone old, or sick, or burdened. No one knows who wrote it. But the sentiment is clear. There is a reckoning beyond the law, beyond the archive, beyond the power of men to conceal and control. Patience may not have lived to see justice, but the ledger, in its final breath, acknowledges that justice was owed. Why does Patience's story matter now, in 2025, more than a century and a half after her death? Because it is not just her story. It is the story of everyone who was silenced, erased, dismissed as insignificant. It is the story of power protecting itself, of truth being buried, of history being written by those who survived, not those who suffered. And it is a reminder that the archive is not neutral. It is not objective. It is a battlefield. What is preserved, what is destroyed, what is hidden, what is revealed, these are choices, and choices reflect power. Patience's story survived because the cover-up was imperfect. The silence was not complete, the gaps were too symmetrical, and eventually someone noticed. But how many other stories did not survive? How many other patiences are buried in unmarked graves, their names unrecorded, their knowledge lost, their resistance forgotten? The question is not just historical. It is present. It is urgent. Whose voices are we silencing now? Whose stories are we failing to preserve? Whose deaths are we failing to investigate? In 2025, a coalition of historians, activists, and descendants of the enslaved launched a project called the Patience Initiative. The goal is to identify and document the stories of enslaved people who were killed for what they knew. People who were literate, who were witnesses, who were threats to the systems that enslaved them. The project is ongoing. Researchers are combing through archives, plantation records, court documents, diaries, letters. They are looking for the gaps, the silences, the suspicious deaths, the names that disappear. And they are finding them. Dozens, hundreds, a pattern of violence that was systematic, intentional, and almost entirely undocumented. The Patience Initiative is not just about the past, it is about the present. It is about ensuring that the mechanisms of silence, the destruction of records, the concealment of evidence, the dismissal of testimony are recognized, named, and resisted. Because silence is not passive. It is active. It is a choice. And memory is resistance. In 2022, a group of descendants of the enslaved population of Belmont Hall filed a lawsuit seeking reparations from the estate of Theodore Belmont's heirs. The lawsuit argued that the Belmont family profited from stolen labor, that they concealed evidence of crimes including murder, and that they owe compensation to the descendants of those they enslaved. The lawsuit was dismissed on procedural grounds. The court ruled that too much time had passed, that the statute of limitations had long since expired, that there was no legal mechanism for holding descendants accountable for the actions of their ancestors. The ruling was expected. But it was also clarifying. It confirmed what many already knew. The law as currently structured cannot provide justice for historical crimes. The legal system that failed to protect patients in 1859 continues to fail her descendants in 2025. But justice is not only legal, it is also moral, historical, communal. And in that sense, the work continues. In 2023, the small grave marker placed in the Belmont burial ground, the stone inscribed with Patience, was vandalized. Someone spray-painted over it, obscuring the name. The vandalism was discovered by a visitor who reported it to the Preservation Society. The society cleaned the stone, they installed a security camera, and the vandalism was never repeated. But the message was clear. There are people who do not want Patience remembered. People who prefer the old narrative, the comfortable silence, the history that does not implicate, does not challenge, does not demand reckoning. The vandalism was an act of erasure, but it failed. The stone was restored. The name is still there, and the act of vandalism itself became evidence. Proof that Patience's story still threatens, still disturbs, still matters. In 2024, a filmmaker requested access to the Belmont family papers for a documentary project on Patience's life. The request was denied by the Louisiana State Archives, citing ongoing legal considerations and privacy concerns. The filmmaker appealed. The appeal was denied. The refusal is part of a broader pattern. Institutions protecting power, even when that power is historical, even when the people being protected are long dead. The archive is not just a repository of documents, it is a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers decide who gets to tell the story. But the filmmaker did not give up. She made the documentary anyway, using publicly available documents, interviews with scholars, footage of the Belmont estate, and a script that acknowledged the limits of what could be known. The documentary premiered in 2025. It was called Patience, The Woman Who Knew Too Much. It has been screened at film festivals, universities, community centers. It has been watched online by hundreds of thousands of people. The archive can refuse access, but it cannot stop the story from being told. Patience was murdered. We may never have legal proof that would satisfy a court. We may never have a signed confession, a witness statement, a smoking gun, but we have the pattern. We have the documents. We have the silences. And patterns, documents, and silences are evidence. Patience knew something that threatened Theodore Belmont. She had access to financial records that revealed the estate's insolvency. She was connected to an abolitionist network that could have exposed the family's crimes. She was literate, intelligent, and legally free, or close enough to freedom that she could not be controlled through the ordinary mechanisms of enslavement. So she was eliminated, quickly, quietly, and then erased. The doctor was paid, the lawyer was consulted, the records were altered, the fires were set, and the silence was enforced for over a century. But silence, like all things built by human hands, is fragile. It requires maintenance, it requires consensus, it requires everyone involved to keep the secret. And eventually, someone talks, someone writes a letter, someone forgets to destroy a document, someone leaves a gap in the ledger that is too obvious to ignore. Patience's story survived because the cover-up was imperfect, and because once it began to unravel, people, scholars, activists, descendants, refused to let it be buried again. This is where the investigation ends. Not because the questions are answered, but because the evidence runs out. The documents have been read, the testimonies have been weighed, the patterns have been traced, and what remains is not certainty but clarity. Patience existed, she mattered, she resisted, she knew, and because she knew, she was killed. Her death was not an anomaly, it was systemic. It was the logic of slavery carried to its conclusion. Eliminate the witness, destroy the evidence, control the narrative. But narratives once disrupted cannot be fully restored. The archive, once opened, cannot be fully closed. And Patience, though dead for 166 years, is more present now than she has been since 1859. She's in the classroom, she's in the documentary, she's in the museum, she is in the grave marker that visitors leave flowers beside. She's in the book that students read, the essays they write, the questions they ask. She is in the fact that you watching this now know her name. That is the power of memory. That is the work of history. That is the resistance that survives when all other resistance has been crushed. Patience did not live to see freedom. But her story has been freed, and that is something. The archive is closed now. The file is sealed. But if you found this investigation compelling, if Patience's story moved you, if you believe that memory matters and silence must be resisted, then I ask you to do one thing: subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, more archives to open, more silences to break, more witnesses to honor. This is the work, and it continues until the next investigation.